Thank you. So, I'm Arthur Sullivan, and the reason for this invitation is that I am developing a course in AI ethics to go here at Memorial. Today is a fateful day. In the Senate meeting this afternoon, we should clear our last hurdle and officially have an AI ethics course, which will be delivered for the first time next year. So I'll read a little bit from the course description just to tell you what we're going to be talking about here. So this is an applied ethics course focused on issues pertaining to the prevalent and growing use of AI in various aspects of contemporary life. The development of AI technology has promised to be one of the most significant, impactful episodes in the history of human civilization. It's barely an overstatement to say that AI is changing everything. This course is about increasing awareness of, literacy in, and sophisticated critical reasoning about the impact and significance of these developments. I'm happy to have with me Dylan White, a former MUN philosophy student who's currently doing a PhD at the University of Guelph on these issues. So Dylan has TA'd and taught and is doing PhD level research. So he's an excellent person to have around. So we're going to do tandem, we're going to talk for 5 minutes and keep switching back and forth. But we start with a disclaimer, and the disclaimer is about dynamism. This emerging field is in continual flux. The relevant technologies keep changing. The landscape changes weekly. There's a constant steady flow of new things that you have to contend with when it comes to trying to keep on top of the ethical issues. As with some other fields in applied ethics, this also applies to healthcare ethics. But here, certainly, the technology runs way ahead of the law. And as a result, there are things that are neither expressly legal nor expressly illegal that are happening and that we have to talk about and apply our critical reasoning tools. So we aim to just give a representative sample of some of the pressing issues. The talk we would give 1 year ago wouldn't be the one we give today. Almost certainly the talk we'd give in 5 years would not be the one we give today. But here's what we're going to run through. A quick introduction. Welcome to the Oligocracy. Okay. And we're going to talk for 5 to 10 minutes about 4 specific issues. Commodification of data, privacy, surveillance kind of issues, how liability and responsibility are changing in the AI context, bias in algorithm-based decision-making, and lastly, deepfakes and the proliferation of misinformation. We'll say, those are just 4 case studies. There's a lot we could have chosen from. We'll also talk about employment, environmental toll, a few other things. And we aim to leave lots of room for questions at the end. So if you have questions, you will be heard. Okay. So moving along here. Welcome to the Oligocracy. So Oligocracy means government by algorithm. The point is AI is here and it's creeping into more and more aspects of your life. AI is at work in banking, medicine, the insurance industry. It's recommending sentences in the law courts in several jurisdictions. It's at work in distributing policing resources, where the police and when. And that obviously has impacts on who ends up getting arrested. Right? Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. Institutions are relying on algorithm-based computational technologies and making crucially important social decisions, economic decisions, political decisions. Okay. Now, the first important lesson in AI ethics is don't try to define AI. Okay. It is a vague beast, and even those fuzzy boundaries change over time. Okay. Like lots of important concepts, complex concepts, intelligent is used in lots of different ways, generally overlapping. Okay? But one thing to note about this lack of a definition of AI, it certainly makes regulation harder. Governments and policymakers don't even have a clear definition of what it is they're trying to regulate. Okay? But what's going on? So clearly, there are lots of tasks that computational algorithm-based technology is way better at than the human mind is. Okay? That's not controversial. And a typical example is something like, what's the 100th digit in the decimal expansion of pi? Okay. A computer can do that way more quickly and with much less chance of error than I could. Okay. And more generally, tasks that involve searching huge databases quickly and finding patterns. These are things that computers are better at than the human mind. So about this, we distinguish the engineering question. Where can we exploit this difference between computers and minds, and how? With the ethical question, what are the costs? And we're not talking about dollar costs. We're philosophers. We're all rich. We don't care about dollars. We're talking about what values are getting transgressed, what rights are getting trod upon, what things need to be seriously rethought in this context. So algocracy is kind of a vague term, shades of gray. I mean, there's already algorithms at work in deciding who gets a mortgage and who doesn't, who gets a loan and who doesn't. Again, where the police get charged. Who's a suitable organ donor? Okay. Large language models are the latest massive explosion on the cultural horizon. These next token predictors, which can comb terabytes of data and average out what to say next. And they're game changers for many, many, many tasks. But nobody thinks that large language models are the end of the story. Extreme algocracy at the other end is the singularity. Our robot overlords are on the way. We're not so worried about that. We're much more worried here. The talk today is more about intentional misuses by malevolent actors, unintended byproducts, or just generally the unfolding revolution on the human horizon. Okay, that is the development of and prevalence of AI technology. So, Dylan, over to you.
Right, thank you, and thanks everyone for being here. So yeah, with regard to this engineering question first, where and how can AI be usefully exploited? The answer, at least from the engineers, from the computer scientists, from the people running these companies, seems to be everywhere and in every way. So it's absolutely pervasive. Algorithmic decision-making mediates not just kind of policing and law and medicine and all those kinds of really impactful, clearly kind of high-stakes situations, but also more mundane, everyday kind of decision-making is increasingly mediated by artificial intelligence. And that's everything from, recommender systems, what news feeds you see, what gets recommended to you on Netflix, on Spotify, to, decisions that we all have to make that have wide-ranging and long-lasting kind of impacts. So increasingly, admissions decisions are being made by artificial intelligence. Same goes for if you apply to a job. The hiring process is just littered with artificial intelligence from the get-go until the end of the hiring process. Arthur mentioned creditworthiness is increasingly mediated by artificial intelligence. So are relationships. We know that increasingly people meet on online dating websites, on these apps, and they use all kinds of sophisticated machine learning, analytics, psychometrics to make matches. So these are kind of just some areas that have, again, wide-ranging, long-lasting impacts on our lives, and they're increasingly mediated by artificial intelligence. So that's why it's important to ask this ethical question. What are the costs? So we're going to start by looking at privacy, surveillance, and commodification of data. And again, as Arthur mentioned, this is kind of the first word in a conversation. Lots more can be said about this than what I'll say here, but just to kind of introduce some of the issues at the forefront here. So it's no secret right now that the kind of increasing capabilities of AI, of large language models, is due in large part to ever increasing larger training data sets, right? So the more data we get, it's been really effective at developing stronger and stronger models, way more than people actually thought was possible. And of course, those larger training data sets, especially with things like ChatGPT and other large language models, they encompass, the whole of the internet, essentially, and a lot of personal information about you. So we all share lots of stuff online. Whether or not you share things that are actually personal or not, a lot of stuff is inferred about you online just based on your clicks, your searches, your purchases, whatever. So there are these profiles being built about you. So one of the kind of arguments that I often hear made in this space, and increasingly by the undergraduate students that I teach when I talk about this stuff, is this kind of argument that, well, why should I care about this data that's being collected about me? Why should I care about privacy? I have nothing to hide. I'm not doing anything kind of weird or creepy or illegal online. So why do I care about this so much? And not only that, I'm happy to, if it's the exchange of my data for using Facebook for excellent recommendations and stuff like that, then sure, have it. So this is the kind of argument that you increasingly see in this space, I think. And I think it's wrong-headed in lots of different ways. I'm going to talk about one way in which I think that's the case today. And I think this is put really well, this 2017 paper by a couple sociologists, Marianne Fourcade and Kieran Healy. So they say that as digital traces of individual behaviors are aggregated, stored, and analyzed, markets see people through a lens of deserving and undeservingness, and classification situations become moral projects. So the idea here, essentially, markets are increasingly incentivized to, increasingly target ads and services to individuals. And so because of that, they're incentivized to collect more and more data, as much data about you as possible, to build these profiles, to classify you into different kinds of groups, into different classification schemes and situations, and based on that, recommend things to you. So sometimes that can be trivial and harmless, whether or not you get shown the ad for like a new Taylor Swift album or something like that. Okay, kind of trivial, but there's lots of more impactful ways in which this can affect people too. So you're essentially, based on these profiles that are being developed because of the commodification of data, you're making certain services available to some people and not to others. And an example of where this is really problematic comes from discriminatory housing practices. So in 2019, the US government sued Facebook for violating the Fair Housing Act. Facebook was essentially, again, as every social media company and lots of other companies do, building profiles of individuals. And based on those profiles of where people live, who they are, their income, and protected attributes like race and gender, were showing some people ads for houses and others weren't seeing those ads. So this violates the Fair Housing Act under discriminatory practices. And, people were making the argument at the time that showing some people housing and showing other people, not showing other people housing, can be just as discriminatory as slamming the door in someone's face. So it's these kinds of practices, these classifying people into one domain and then making certain things available to them. We don't call it social scoring, but I would encourage us to think more critically about that this is a kind of way of saying these people deserve this, these people don't deserve this. Another example of this is in surveillance in hiring. So again, hiring practices are just littered with AI applications. One of those is a lot of companies using these analytical tools that are able to build a profile of you essentially by crawling the internet, crawling all the social media, everything they can find about you, and building a profile that will, again, label you into suitable or not suitable for this job. So, we can no longer assume that the resume and the CV that I give to my potential employer is what they're going to make the decision based on, right? They're using all of these kinds of tools that, again, classifying individuals into particular kinds of groups, and based on that, making decisions about whether or not they are worthy or not. And this is all because of kinds of growing infringements on privacy and because of the incentives for the commodification of data. And so the last thing I'll end with here, again, much more that can be said about all of this, is the importance of thinking not just about individual privacy, but collective privacy. There are lots of ways in which your individual privacy is not necessarily infringed upon, but we can still have these aggregate group level and collective effects. So there's a tool right now, you can go to it, called Prism from Environics. And if you put in your postal code there, it will give you a huge profile of who they think you are, how you think, what you like to buy. And again, increasingly companies are using this information about you, or that's inferred about you based on where you live, to target different services to you. A lot of people use it in different government settings. for allocating social services and stuff like that too. So you might think, okay, well, there's no individual infringement on my privacy, but there is this kind of group level aggregate effect. And if you look at the groups that are on Environics 2, they are grouped, some of them at least, by class, by income, and by race. And increasingly, so we see in, say, the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act that's going through government right now, a lot of the way that artificial intelligence systems are being thought about is their impact on individuals. If we only focus on individual harms, especially in the context of privacy, we're going to miss out on a lot of what we actually think is harmful about these tools. And the other thing that we need to think about here too, relatedly, is the right of what can be inferred about you. So we can no longer think about just what can be collected about you, but what can be inferred about who you are based on what is available about you. So those are just a couple of the ways in which I think it's really important to think about privacy and surveillance in this space. So I'll hand it back to Arthur.
Thanks. And the next stop on our tour is on concepts of liability and responsibility and how these are changing now. When there's harmful effects and AI is involved, it becomes quite complicated to sort out. So in moral philosophy and in the law, you're responsible for something if and only if it's under your control. That's a basic premise that we all start from. And so we distinguish between toddlers and adults, or we talk about various mental health afflictions that can be a relevant mitigating circumstance. We say this agent was not fully responsible for their actions. That kind of basic intuitive connection between responsibility and control gets problematized. So this is in a very influential early paper by Matthias on the responsibility gap. And basically what Matthias argues is, to the extent that we can build machines that themselves learn, this gap between responsibility and control really gets complicated. And there's mountains of subsequent literature spinning out of this Matthias paper, trying to sort out ways in which responsibility, liability, how we should think about these concepts post-AI. Okay? So it's no longer the good old days where the lead engineer signs off on the bridge and anything that subsequently happens to the bridge is the lead engineer's responsibility. Okay? So lots of this subsequent literature tends to be focused on cases like collateral damage by autonomous weapons. Who's responsible when a drone takes out a children's hospital, or pedestrians being killed by self-driving cars? This is kind of where a lot of these issues are concretely being debated. I won't say much about autonomous weapons. War is kind of a moral chaos anyway. Though I'll mention there was a good article in Vox magazine 2019 called Death by Algorithm. Good title. And it's about these difficult questions of liability and responsibility with autonomous weapons. Okay, self-driving cars. So Google tells me this morning that something like 18 or 19 people have, up to this point, been killed by a self-driving car. There have been almost 20 fatalities. There was one famous case in Tempe, Arizona, 2018, when Elaine Hertzberg was killed by a self-driving Uber. She was crossing the road in the middle of the block in the dark of night, and she was hit and killed. Who's responsible? The driver, the sensor manufacturer, the software company. It seems to me, as an outsider, not a techie, the sensor was at fault here, and my new Toyota probably has a better sensor than this car did. Whoever made the brakes, whoever made the steering, Uber itself. Okay. This is the responsibility gap. There's a lot of mitigating things in between. Now, in some ways, the people with the easiest job are the lawyers. Sue everybody. That's what they teach you in law school, right? And here's a quote from a newspaper story about this Elaine Hertzberg case. While a conditional settlement buried the liability issue, while a confidential settlement buried the liability issue, it suggested a sufficient legal cause of action. Okay? The courts do have to, apart from cases where you can get the parties to settle, the courts do have to sort out these issues. And this unfolding AI revolution on the human horizon, here's a case where issues of accountability are ever more complex, and there's a growing gap widening. Our intuitive folk concepts are being pulled apart here. And I'll throw in one more recent case. This is less than a year ago. You may have read about the Belgian man who committed suicide almost a year ago. And in the last 48 hours of his life, he spent a lot of time interacting with an AI mental health chatbot named Eliza. And so there's a lot of attention now being poured to the interactions between himself and Eliza. To what extent is Eliza responsible? If so, who's liable? In the sensational news reports, it was claimed that his wife said, without Eliza, he would still be here. So, back over to Dylan for the next stop.
Yeah, so I think another important thing to note just in this space really quickly is that a lot of people have these kind of knee-jerk reactions to these questions of responsibility, like, oh, I know who's responsible here. It's Tesla, or it's the maker of the sensor or something like that. I think a lot of those knee-jerk reactions are kind of compelling and intuitive, but what we need to be careful of is that, like, when we have these knee-jerk reactions and say we're holding this individual responsible for something that went wrong in a sophisticated, complex system that is continually learning, we're doing away with how we normally conceive of responsibility in both law and ethics, right? And that can lead to lots of kinds of messy situations and lead us down a very kind of slippery slope, right? Where you're holding people liable for things that they just had no control or knowledge over. So it's important to think, I think, again, in this space, we might think, oh, we have the kind of liability and responsibility tools to tackle these things. And maybe we do come down on the side of holding an individual responsible or something. But if we do that, we need to be aware that we're really changing how we traditionally think about these things. Okay, so on to algorithmic bias. You could teach a whole graduate seminar on algorithmic bias. So I'm just going to talk about two, what I think are kind of underappreciated aspects of algorithmic bias today. So there's this excellent paper, 2021, from Sina Fazlpour and Dave Danks, where they lay out this kind of taxonomy of algorithmic bias to really make it clear in what ways can an algorithm be biased, in what kind of different senses does it make sense to talk about this. So the two in the middle here, in data and in modeling and validation, I think of they're what kind of gets the lion's share of the attention when we think about algorithmic bias. So especially in data, right, we kind of have this saying, garbage in, garbage out. If you get bias into a predictive system, you're going to get bias out of that system because it's making decisions based on biased data. So lots of important work done in this space. And related to that, we have this issue of error distribution as well in modeling and validation. So if you have a biased system, for example, that is being used to predict likelihood of reoffending, and we've seen lots of examples of tools like this, like Compass, that have been used in the States to predict who's going to reoffend, who isn't. Much higher error rates for individuals of minority groups. So a lot more false positives for people of color, saying they are much more likely to reoffend than is actually the case. So we have, and a lot more false negatives for people that are not of minority backgrounds. So we have these problems of error distribution because, again, of this bias in, bias out problem. So these are talked about in a lot of the literature, very important. Today I want to highlight, first off, a kind of prior step to even collecting data and building a predictive model. And this is in problem specification. So in this paper, they use the example of university admission. So I'm going to use that here as well. So let's say we want to build a predictive algorithm that's going to help us with admissions, or it's going to help us with allocating resources to students, scholarships, so on, right? So you need to, first of all, before you even begin collecting data and before you even begin to build a predictive model, you need to establish what is the target variable here. So what are we trying to predict? Presumably you're trying to predict something like student success, right? So what is student success? How are you going to define that in order to build your predictive model? Student success is not something that can be easily objectively quantified. It's not something that is free of context and value, right? So in just specifying the target variable, you have this kind of prior step where bias can enter into the equation. So you might think, well, student success is GPA. Student success is likelihood of gainful employment after completing a program. Student success is respect from other students. It's mental health. It's, it could be all of these things. None of which you can, well, some of which perhaps, but a lot of which you can't clearly quantify. So in just specifying what we mean, we bring in a lot of value and context into what we mean by student success. That's then going to be used to allocate admissions or allocate resources, scholarships, and so on that can introduce bias. So, if you define student success by something like their grades in the first year or something, then that could have a very kind of disparate negative impact on minority students who are dealing with other struggles in their first year of university or something like that. So again, just nailing down what is it that you're trying to predict, how do you define what that is, you change institutional dynamics from the get-go by introducing the use of a predictive system in defining that variable. And you introduce bias in lots of interesting ways that you might not think you would have otherwise. So important to think about that even before we start thinking about data and building the algorithm. And then the other way, which has gotten more attention, but still I think deserves a lot more, is in deployment. So data evolution and feedback loops are a big problem when it comes to deploying predictive algorithms. And this has been especially the case in, or well documented at least, in predictive policing cases. Tinette Gebru has done a lot of work here. So she uses this example, right? So if you just take, I'm sure you could probably take any city, but she uses the example of a national survey that was done and picks out Oakland and drug use in Oakland. So drug use, widespread across the city, kind of evenly distributed across the city. Drug-related arrests disproportionately have outsized rates in Black neighborhoods, right? So if you build a predictive model with that data, which people have using tools like PredPol, then you end up allocating policing resources to those neighborhoods. So this is kind of the second one, in a sense, where you bias in, bias out. But then there's a further step that happens, right? As you deploy police to those neighborhoods, you make more and more arrests, then validating the bias that you built the model with. And then you additionally use those arrests to train a new model. So you're kind of not only reinforcing, you're amplifying the actual societal bias that you might think that these systems are useful for getting around in some sense, right? And there is a sense in which AI systems and algorithmic bias sometimes just put human bias on blast a little bit. It's sometimes easier to just see the bias in these algorithms. But again, if we make the mistake of not accounting for these kinds of feedback loops, and you start attributing causes where there are none, or you use that additional data to train new models, you need to take into account the way that the interventions and policies that are developed with these predictive models are changing the model of the world. They're changing the world that you're trying to model. And if you don't take account for that, then you get these problems in feedback loops and predictive policing. So again, much more that could be said about algorithmic bias, but I'll turn it over to Arthur there.
I think this is a case where there has been progress in the last 5 years, where the biases that are at work in the software tools for predictive policing or sentencing recommendations have been, people like Tinette Gebru have drawn attention to them, and it's led to better tools. So this is kind of a positive story, what's happening on this front, I think, in the last few years. As for deepfakes and the proliferation of misinformation, I mean, personally, this is the one that scares me the most. Not that there's going to be robot overlords, but that there's a powerful tool apt for misuse by malevolent actors here. So this is one of the scary things that's well underway. There's a CNN headline 2 weeks ago, January 24th. The deepfake era in US politics is already upon us. And what prompted this was deepfake robocalls in the New Hampshire primary, involving fake depictions of Joe Biden spreading strategic misinformation, even using the word malarkey, right? Joe Biden is the only one other than this algorithm who would choose the word. So, knowledge by testimony is a very prevalent category that philosophers talk an awful lot about. So any knowledge about stuff I haven't seen or touched, anything I think I know about World War II, penguins, electrons, and so on, this is knowledge by testimony. And there are entrenched standards for what counts as knowledge by testimony in the law courts, in the epistemology seminars. And with the recent advent of really good deepfake technology, these entrenched standards of knowledge by testimony are definitely getting undermined, to say the least. Okay? So, I mean, what's the standard for reliable testimony? A photo, a recording, a video. These are reproductions of what actually happened, right? That's what you might have thought 5 years ago. Okay? No longer. AI technology is ever more easily available. It's higher and higher quality every week. Okay. So this is, of the four things we talked about, maybe the most recent. So Rini is now a recent classic, this paper called Deepfakes and the Epistemic Backstop, which kind of discusses the impact on our knowledge by reliable testimony standards. Here's a line from Rebecca Rini's abstract. What could happen to our collective democratic processes of information sharing when agents can be deepfaked into doing or saying whatever a third party decides? Good question, hasn't yet been answered. This is, the experiment's still underway. There's a subsequent paper by Habgood Coots, which refers to this as the epistemic apocalypse, deepfakes and the epistemic apocalypse. Again, good title, but he's overstating it a little, for sure. There still are standards. So, I mean, there's certainly lots of famous cases we could talk about here, not just Joe Biden and malarkey. In the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, there was a famous poor qualified deep fake of Zelensky telling the Ukrainians to surrender. It was so bad that it didn't fool anybody 2 years ago, but it could be much better now. I believe I was trying to find, there was a case in recent European politics, even just in January, where a successful deepfake played a role in the outcome of an election. Here you got an arms race at work, similar to ChatGPT detection. ChatGPT avoiding detection gets better. ChatGPT detector gets better. There's an arms race at work here in terms of identifying deepfakes and avoiding their detection. So just last week in the publication Politico, there's a story about in-progress EU legislation mandating big tech to label and identify AI-generated content. So they specifically mentioned TikTok, X, Facebook. The EU is trying to legally mandate that they identify and label AI-generated content. Okay? So for sure, these are crucial issues. The potential for misuse is scary. And again, just a clear respect in which AI is changing the landscape.
I'll add up just one thing here. Just to say, I mean, and Regina Rini kind of makes this point in this paper too, that so we do have this arms race right now between more effective deepfakes and then tools that are going to allow us to more effectively label those deepfakes, notice those deepfakes, the effectiveness of those tools are going to be very limited in a lot of ways. And Virginia Rooney wants to make the point that it's kind of besides the point. We've already seen with misinformation that the corrective travels not nearly as fast and widespread as the misinformation itself. So the worry here is that once the thing is out there, yes, we might have a corrective after the fact. Yes, we might know at some point that this is a deep fake. But is that going to matter that much, I think? And this is I think this upcoming election year is going to be a kind of limit test for this paper. Is this epistemic backstop truly going to fall away? Are people going to be taken by these deep fakes in a meaningful way? And I think it is something to worry about. It's just in the context of, again, we've seen this with misinformation. Correctives don't necessarily work. Opinions about the stuff will probably predictably fall along partisan lines. And so even if they're known widely as deepfakes, they can still have really kind of outsized impacts on political institutions and outcomes.
So that's a survey. If this sounds interesting, take the course that's going to exist by 6 p.m. tonight, Philosophy 2150 AI Ethics. So we just talked about we had a lot of different things to choose from. Obviously, AI and its effect on employment, what kind of jobs can should reasonably worry that LLMs, large language models, are going to take over, who can be replaced by an algorithm. The impact of AI in human relationships is a massive topic, a lot of literature there about, medical robots replacing nurses and how that's going to change the experience of a patient in a hospital setting. Lots of issues. So one thing that we're going to end on here is the environmental toll of the AI revolution. We tend to think of AI as green just simply because it doesn't kill as many trees, right? But that is so massively not the case. It's an electricity consumer unlike anything else that the humans have come up with. So I think Dylan's got some data here about the carbon footprint.
Yeah, so I mean, it is true. Like the environmental impact of this stuff is just massive. There's this tendency to think of computing as something that happens in the cloud, intelligence as some kind of network effect or something. But as Arthur said, lots of electricity, lots of water, lots of cooling needed for these systems. So this paper is kind of quaint and outdated now, but we can already see in pounds of CO2 what it takes to train a large language model transformer neural architecture. So this is 2019. We can see already it's far exceeding lots of other kinds of things that we pay attention to when we pay attention to carbon footprints. This model has 213 million parameters. That's 2019. You can see the effect there. Models today have on the order of billions or trillions of parameters. So we can imagine the kind of hockey stick curve that we're seeing with the carbon footprint of these tools. And lots of rare earth minerals that are needed for the GPUs, the AI chips that are used to train these models too, that have an outsized environmental toll. And the other thing I'll just end with here, in addition to the environmental toll, there's a human labor cost to all this stuff too that often gets forgotten about. So, I mentioned at the outset, the effectiveness of something like ChatGPT being due to large training data sets. Well, it's also due to reinforcement learning with human feedback. So lots and lots of humans interacting with these things, labeling outputs as good or bad, toxic, whatever. And all reports show that a lot of this labor is very poorly paid, and there's a lot of it. So far from being this kind of ephemeral technology, lots of human impact and lots of environmental impact here too. That is, we're just going to need to think about as we think about the kind of next generation of these tools. So, end it there.
So, yeah, we've got some time for questions.
Okay, I got a question.
Yes.
I got a question. I might have a lot of questions. I'm not a philosopher, but and if I say stuff wrong, you can correct me. But you talked about the bias in the system and correcting the bias. But so is there any escape from any bias? Because, okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're talking about a societal bias, right? It comes from values, correct? Like, it can, right? So how we value things, and values tend to be normative. Is that right? Right? Depends on the time and place. So then how can you ever escape bias in these systems? Can you? I don't know. Because what a bias is today won't be what a bias is tomorrow.
Yeah, well,
right?
so not perfectly, and I think it's also important to distinguish between bias and prejudice, right?
Yes.
We all have just biases that we use in our everyday decision making that are necessary in some ways, right? So what we really mean is we don't want these algorithms to be prejudiced.
Well, that
And
changes
so,
with time too, though.
yes, it does, and so, but it's almost an engineering question in a way, right? So there are different ways in which people define fairness when it comes to algorithmic bias. So say something like predicting rates of likelihood to reoffend. So what way do you get rid of bias in a system like that? Well, one option is anti-classification. So you just don't use protected attributes. You end up with much less accurate and effective models if you go that route. You calibrate the model so that no matter what the score that it outputs, it means the same thing across populations, across groups. Or you can have parity. So you have essentially equal error distribution rates across populations. So you might lose a little bit of accuracy, but you have parity. You don't have those kind of false positive, false negative kinds of disparities. When you have base rates that differ for likelihood to reoffend, you can't satisfy both of those at the same time, right? So you kind of need to decide what do we mean by fair? How much kind of bias are we going to accept? So
it is all based on what your root or what you start as defining that bias, right? Or that prejudice.
Yeah, I mean,
and I'm just saying, in 100 years, if we don't find, what you just said as a prejudice, then you know what I mean? Like,
in a sense, I'd say bias is inevitable. These algorithms are making evaluative judgments based on something. Right? But you can talk about better or worse, and we can tell some success stories. Like the early kind of resume scanning job search algorithms turned out to privilege college-educated white males who live in North California because they are the ones who develop the software tools, right? And that, with the hindsight of 10 years later, we can see how that worked and how that's been improved. Or the algorithms that were involved in sentencing recommendations in lots of jurisdictions across North America.
But that but that would depend on what society values, right? Because if you fed a large learning model with all the data and stuff from Nazi Germany, right? It would predict, it would prefer a white, Aryan person, and because of the society, that'd be great, right? So then, so
there is push in this space. I mean, so this relates to what's called like the value alignment problem. So we want to align these systems with some kind of value. Values are pluralistic and they change. So there is push for OpenAI is working on this now for a more kind of democratic AI. So it's kind of grassroots, participatory, collecting as much data as possible about what kinds of decisions people make across a wide variety of populations and coming to some agreement about what kind of values we can aggregate from those different groups, right? So you're never going to have something that satisfies every population perfectly, but we can probably make progress.
You guys are trying pretty hard as philosophers to come up with an answer.
Well, I think they're philosophical answers. They're engineering solutions.
I'm gonna shut up then.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
It's an important issue.
Yeah,
and a hard one.
I guess one thing that comes to mind is that the job, I think at least for some ethicists in the Western philosophical tradition, the job is not just to describe how people actually value things, but to prescribe ethics, to prescribe values actually, to assert and justify moral judgments. And so we need not just be relativistic about values, actually. That isn't the only position to take with regards to values. So we can, if we wish, make judgments and reason about those judgments regarding AI and what we ought to do with it, or what effects are good or bad, what a particular population thinks is the case on average. And of course, there are differences within populations about what is valuable. It need not be correct just because a majority thinks something is correct, right?
Yeah.
So that's a kind of a digging deeper, though, into the task of ethics, I think.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it relates to bias too. I mean, one of the things, so I consulted with lots of different people around the university in putting this course together. And one guy I talked to a fair bit was Dave Churchill in computer science, he's got a PhD in AI. The course is in the computer science department that have AI in the title. He teaches them. And he'd say things like, it's math, not magic, right? AI is just an algorithm, right? You have to decide what the parameters are. You have to decide what they're worth. You know, it's the programmer who's got to, you know, what are we looking for and what do we value? That's not anything an algorithm is going to tell you, right? Those are decisions that the programmer or the software designer or, you know.
Although,
yeah,
what comes to mind there is that since we're in an educational institution here,
yeah.
I suppose I could, in theory, get a generative AI system to write me a paper about values and what we ought to do.
Yeah.
You know, how we ought to use AI systems and all that. But you know, I think it's important for us to sort of keep up our own cognitive skills regarding these things. Unfortunately, maybe an AI system could tell us what we ought to value someday, right? Maybe people would start believing it.
As a philosophy professor, I'm less impressed by large language models all the time because they write bad philosophy papers. They're identifiable and they're worse. So, I mean, it's a next token predictor that averages out what to say next based on what it's trained on. So, and that works for lots of things. It works. I mean, Luke Roman did a wonderful job in his talk about how ChatGPT is great for things like university mission statements. It comes up with transforming our horizons for a brighter tomorrow. Making Hollywood scripts, I'm sure ChatGPT, I mean, it's so formulaic. It could write, you know, but averaging out what to say next based on what everyone else has said. I mean, maybe lots of jobs are like that, but certainly lots aren't. And it's a crappy university paper.
Yeah, it's unclear exactly what the next step is in this space too, because people are kind of hit the limits of available data. The next kind of step that people are working on in this space too, you know, you make, okay, now they have these limitations. Are they going to get better? The next step is what they call self-play. So the same way that like those AlphaGo systems were trained to play chess and Go, they play against each other. What people are talking about doing now is getting these systems to talk to each other. So they're bad at coming up with anything novel, but what they are good at is saying this is good or bad. So they want them to get these models talking to each other and see if that gets you any further in the context of being able to generate novel and meaningful content in any way. So they're taking this kind of borrowing from what we've seen effective in deep learning in other domains to see if it works here. No proof of concept yet, no clear way towards making that work, but that's the idea that people are working with now to see if we can get these things to do more than just average out over all the training data that they have.
Transforming our horizons for a brighter tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Gil?
I have a question that you raised about the difficulty of culpability and liability accusation against a machine or a piece of software. It was one of those slides there. There it is. That's the one. Who is at fault? Who do I sue? Who do I press charges against? And you know, we hear this in a lot of discussion. You know, it's much more complicated to you know, press charges against a machine or a piece of software than against an individual. But does it have to be? I mean, I don't mean it in a tongue-in-cheek way. I mean more legalistically and even epistemologically. Why, in the case of the lady that was run over, let's say it's a software Why is it we do our study, we don't act in a knee-jerk reaction way, and we figure out this is not a complex issue in the sense that this was a software malfunction. So why would it then be complicated to decide where culpability and liability, both ethically and legally, rest? I know it's more complicated to sue Tesla than to sue Gil Shalev, but it's still doable, right? Or is the risk or the fear about this that it would never be done because, said companies are, I don't know, above protection, above the law and so on and so forth? What do you guys think about that?
I mean, I think in part, at least, the problem is, okay, so say, someone's killed by a self-driving car, you just say, well, it's the software, that's the problem there. We're not going to hold anyone responsible. We're going to, no, this model is no longer going to be used. We're going to work on developing the software.
Right.
Cold comfort to the family of
Right.
the person that was killed, right? People look for punishment in this space too, right? And I think one of the obstacles we'll be up against is just the deeply unsatisfactory nature of saying we're punishing the system by putting it out of use or something like that, right? So I think there is a way, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but there's going to be a lot of pushback against that. There's just it's going to be a deeply unsatisfactory way of dealing with instances, especially where people are severely harmed.
Right.
Now, I think what's new about this ethical challenge is the gap and the multiplicity of actors, or multiplicity of agents, multiplicity of candidates. It's not like I stole your wallet or the engineer signed off on a bridge that collapsed a year later. What software? The sensor, the brakes, the steering? In the case of self-driving cars, so the driver of this car in that famous case I was talking about ended up doing a prison term because she was watching video at the time. She was not paying attention. And I think still at the time, and maybe now, self-driving cars require you to have your hands on the wheel. It won't function without that, precisely for this kind of, to distribute the blame.
There used to be a hack for a Tesla. You could jam a water bottle in there somewhere and it would keep going.
Yeah.
But then if that hack exists, then who's responsible for that hack?
Right. That's kind of a convenient case.
Tesla has also built in their own hacks where if the car is getting into an unavoidable accident, it'll switch from self-driving back to manual driving. Right before the accident happens, there's been cases of that. So they've built in this. Well,
It's your fault.
Yeah. So you got the lawyers for the Uber, you got the lawyers for the company which designed the sensor, you got the lawyers for the company which designed the brakes, you got the lawyers for the company which designed the steering. It's getting crowded, and it's a new kind of challenge.
Absolutely. I wouldn't mind following this up with a more technical question, if nobody has anything else. As you said, it's very difficult and murky to pinpoint a definition of AI. I think you probably said it's practically somebody quoted that there isn't one. There's no single definition. Do you guys think you could, I know when it comes to, let's say, data mining and using data in a variety of ways, that stuff has been done way before there was AI. So what is different technically? I don't mean philosophically. Technically, mathematically, computer-wise, what is it that AI does that now in the last, 10 years or so, 15 years, that it didn't do, we didn't do 20 years ago when there was still data mining happening and there was still, dating websites that were collecting ways of matching people together without this AI? What exactly, I guess I'm going to ask you for a definition. Yeah. What exactly is AI in this respect that is different now in terms of what does it do? How does it do it?
So I'm going to give a kind of unsatisfactory answer that I'm not going to define AI, but I kind of alluded earlier to the impressiveness of just scaling these models. It's gotten us a hell of a lot farther than a lot of people thought. It's gotten us a hell of a lot farther than so data has just grown exponentially, and that's been a huge part of it. And so what's so impressive about the transformer architecture is, and that's what a lot of these new models are built on, is what they call an attention mechanism. And I don't know the nitty-gritty technical details of this, but what it allows the system to do, whereas before a predictive system was given an input and then generating an output, the attention system allows it to, while it's generating its output, continually refer back to the input. And so based on the semantic space that's created with the input and its new output, it's continually predicting and iterating on top of that. So that's where we see a lot of the impressive language abilities. I mean, so more and more, I think, AI historically has been defined in the context of human intelligence.
Yes.
And that's becoming less and less of a meaningful way to think about these tools. So again, I don't have a definition for you, but it's these kinds of new techniques in deep learning. It's the data, and I think all of this just changes how we need to think about AI in the context of comparing it to human intelligence.
Absolutely.
Before we end, there is a question in the chat there that came up.
Let me read it out loud. This is a question by Mark Pica. Speaking of training data, is it ethical to use an AI tool that was trained on copyrighted data without permission to use said data?
There's a court case about that.
Yeah.
Lots of court cases.
There are
about
multiple court cases. So this is a case, I think, where it's being litigated
the
and might
laws.
come down differently in different jurisdictions.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, this is one that's in the courts right now. Is it ethical? Probably in some instances and probably not in others. I mean, when it comes to the intellectual property of individuals, like artists whose work is being, so I think I would look at the ethical problem not in the using publicly available copyrighted data, but what's done with that data. So if you're using copyrighted data to train a model to generate art, and then that AI tool is then displacing the workers whose art it was trained on, then that is a clear kind of ethical problem. If training it on the copyrighted data in the first place is an ethical problem, I don't know.
I'll come back to Gil's question just to wrap it up. So, I mean, the term AI was coined in 1956. And there was a splash of early AI, deep blue chess playing programs, but then it kind of ran out of momentum, and there was what was called the AI winter through the 80s and 90s, when not much new was happening and lots of people thought it was a dead project. The AI spring is when Google engineers figured something out in the first decade of the 21st century. And it was explained to me once what it was, a certain kind of machine learning that hadn't been done before, that now your toaster's doing. Right. Okay. So the answer is the AI spring. Ask a computer scientist.
Machine learning.
Back propagation is a huge part.
Yeah. We're done?
No.
Okay.
That was
Thanks.
Thank you.
That was the question.
Yeah.